Torna amb Ciència, una sèrie fonamental per repensar el feminisme, la història i la cultura científica. Comencem! Avui contem amb Francesca Bray, historiadora i antropòloga de la ciència i la tecnologia i professora emèrita a la Universitat d'Edimburg. Els seus estudis es centren en la història de la tecnologia, especialment l'agricultura en el context xinès. També treballa amb la història de l'alimentació, aplicant sempre un enfocament decolonial i sensible al gènere. Ha estat 5 anys presidenta de la Society for History of Technology i ha obtingut importants reconeixements. És la història de la ciència i la tecnologia sexista?
I'd never thought of that question before, actually, in such a deep way, because I think it's the whole issue of what is science and technology and what we consider its history is, in fact, a very modern, bracketed kind of enterprise, because the modern world we inhabit is so structured around science and technology, with science being our God and technology being our Archangel Gabriel, who makes everything happen and brings us progress and salvation. Obviously, in that kind of history, where the enterprises of science and technology have been mostly restricted to white men, then the history of technology and of science can be sexist if you don't actually critique why it is that we're doing this history. On the other hand, if you broaden the history of science and technology, as many critical historians of science and technology have done, to issues of knowledge, practice, materiality, techniques, etc., then you open the way not only for a much longer trajectory of human experience with many, many more people involved, but you also open the way to look at why it is that in the modern world, even today, it is rare for women, just as it is rare for non-white people, to be at the very top of this hierarchy.
Com s'hauria de commemorar la ciència? Què n'opines del Dia Internacional de la Dona i la Nena a la Ciència?
I think is an absolutely wonderful enterprise, but it's not surprising that we're going to have to rescue people rather than actually ask what they did. So I think this is a really interesting topic. It's tricky to handle because you don't want to end up saying, oh, you know, real science is what the big white boys did, but we could rescue the other people and give them a place as well. We really want to use this to rethink why it is we think that science and technology are so wonderful and what we think they are. So that, I think, is where historians, and particularly feminist historians of science and technology, have an essential role to play, just as do, decolonial projects, because then we actually look at why do we think these things are so important? We don't want to say science doesn't exist. We don't want to say facts are just a political invention, but we want to have the tools to look at them critically and to say that nothing is inevitable, that we need to find out why this happened this way and how it could happen differently.
Quan vas decidir incorporar la perspectiva de gènere en els teus estudis?
Came to this myself from initially working on the history of agriculture in China, which goes back a very long way. So I was working with archaeology and I was working with ancient historical texts and things of that nature. And there it wasn't so much the gender and the feminist approach for retrieving women that first struck me, but the fact that you have to get into these histories, the people who are actually doing the work, not just the people who are writing about it or making theories out of it. So it was then easy to make the transition to a more consciously feminist historical approach, historiography, because I think one of the huge contributions of feminism in this field, as of Marxism, is that it looks specifically at the construction of difference and the construction and maintenance of hierarchies of status and power. So feminist history for me wasn't, and for most feminist historians, I think, wasn't just about retrieving women. It was about intersectionality. We didn't call it that then.
Existeix un interès real en integrar els fets o les dinàmiques no occidentals a una imatge més general de com ha evolucionat el món?
And I think there really is. And I think that particularly the post-colonial, decolonial thrust in history of science and technology today is really opening up new vistas. The new geographies that it brings to us. It is very difficult still to decenter Europe and the United States. And one reason why this is so difficult, which many of the scholars involved ruefully acknowledge but have to turn to their advantage, is that European institutions, and especially American institutions, they exercise a hegemony. English becomes the language, just as in the 18th century, French or German were the languages of the learned, supposedly the global languages of the learned. Now English is the language of learning, and there's no getting away from it. And that reinforces certain concepts and certain approaches, because the conversation appears to be universal, but it is actually very hermetic and self-contained. So that's why it's so important for people, I think, maybe to take advantage of this terrible pandemic Zoom, which has us all seated at home, to do a bit more really specific decentering, and to take advantage of the fact that this means that a university or a group of scholars in Zimbabwe, for example, can actually organize something at no greater cost, material and economic, than somebody in Harvard. And then really to get these global nodes and networks on a more even basis, rather than everything channeling into the United States and Europe. So what do I suggest that we might do with all this? Well, I think that one of the ways in which it's really important is that it reminds us that none of our categories, almost none of our categories, is actually universal. And none of our dynamics is inevitable.
Podria desenvolupar el concepte gainotècnics del que parlen els articles? El concepte gainotècnics es podria definir com un conjunt de tecnologies quotidianes que defineixen el paper de la dona, com una nova forma creativa d'explorar com les societats tradueixen els principis morals i socials en una xarxa de formes materials i pràctiques corporals.
Thought was a useful way of looking at how everyday technologies define women's roles. And obviously in different societies or in different strata of a particular society, different technologies define women's roles differently and define different kinds of women. But also it helps you understand that the category of female and its opposition to or complementarities with male or men, and the kinds of organization and hierarchies of male identity are always contingent and changing. They're always a historical fact to be explained. They can never be taken for granted. So when I was working on the changes in gynotechnics in late imperial China and the way in which women were associated with or involved in different technical practices and technical expertise, this was not just about, perhaps how economists would study it, the change in the way in which production was organized or consumption was organized. It was actually a way of looking at the way in which Chinese ideas about male and female, Chinese ideas about family, Chinese ideas about state and person shifted and changed over time and were instantiated and embodied in technical practices. So I thought that was great fun doing it for China. And I thought, well, I would like to do it for contemporary California, where I was living at the time, and see, how it translates there. And we had a terrific time with my students there. I would say, okay, it's not just gynotechnics. Every social identity probably has some kind of set of technologies associated with it in your everyday life. So go ahead and tell me about it. So, I take my grandmother as an example. So it was a lovely way to sort of open up complicated social and political and psychological relationships just through ordinary everyday things that people were using all the time. And I think that's the huge attraction of the history of technology, which appeals to many people. Well, many people are put off because they say, oh, technology is all about IT or going to the moon or Tesla, or technology is all about, railway engines. But technology is a way of looking at things for me, a way of connecting materialities and practices and people and their relationships. And of course, embedded in that, all kinds of interesting concepts about power, but also about different worldviews. And it can be a way of, if not necessarily retrieving them, at least thinking about ways to try and understand those other worlds which don't correspond to our values and expectations today.
Quines dificultats I reptes consideres que hi ha als estudis de la ciència I la tecnologia?
I think sometimes if an academic talks too much about, meaning and power and this, that, and the next thing, and they can't actually demonstrate why it is that this fork or piece of cloth or steam engine actually makes it happen, then the argument is not so convincing for the general public. And I think it's very important, obviously, for scholarship and political commitment and communication to go together. And in both senses, because increasingly in history of technology, critical history of technology these days, efforts are being made by scholars in universities actually to work with people who are not in the academic sphere, and to, whether it be, historians of sugar working with contemporary communities in Glasgow and in Trinidad, where sugar has been treated and sugar has been grown, sugar is still treated, sugar is still grown, not just to get data, but actually to ask what kinds of history should we be writing? Who is history for? And who should be involved in not just making it, but producing the narratives, producing the stories.
Thank you so much, Francesca, for your interview. Aquest ha estat el segon episodi de la segona edició de Fem Ciència. No us perdeu els següents. Fins aviat!